Imagine being the most powerful man in Britain, the one person Winston Churchill trusted with everything, the one who knew every secret, every backroom deal, every decision that never made it into the history books. And then one day, just like that, you're gone. Not dead, not arrested, just erased from the story. That's exactly what happened to one man, and the more you dig into it, the more uncomfortable the whole thing becomes. Most people who know anything about Winston Churchill think they know the full picture. The cigars, the whiskey, the iconic speeches, the bulldog spirit that supposedly saved Western civilization. And look, Churchill was undeniably one of the most fascinating political figures of the 20th century. Nobody's taking that away from him. But here's the thing about fascinating people. They tend to cast very long shadows, and in those shadows, some very strange things happen to the people who get too close. Today we're talking about one of those people. His name was Lord Beaverbrook, and his story is one of the most bizarre, overlooked, and frankly unsettling chapters in the entire Churchill saga. William Maxwell Aitken, better known as Lord Beaverbrook, was not some minor footnote in British history. This was a man who built one of the most powerful media empires in the world, who owned newspapers that shaped public opinion across the entire British Empire, who had the ear of kings and prime ministers for decades. And when the Second World War began, Churchill pulled him directly into the inner circle, giving him one of the most critical jobs in the entire war effort: Minister of Aircraft Production. Think about what that actually means. Britain, in 1940, was fighting for its survival. The Luftwaffe was pounding English cities night after night, and the entire outcome of the Battle of Britain depended on whether the RAF had enough Spitfires and Hurricanes to keep fighting. Beaverbrook was the man responsible for making sure those planes existed. Without him, the story of the war might have ended very differently, and Churchill knew it. So here you have this extraordinary situation where two of the most powerful men in Britain are locked in what looks like a perfect partnership. Churchill provides the vision, the rhetoric, the iron will that keeps the country from collapsing into despair. Beaverbrook provides the ruthless, almost terrifying efficiency that actually turns that vision into physical reality. He was famous for calling up factory managers at 2 a.m, screaming down the telephone about production numbers, personally intervening in supply chains that the entire bureaucratic machinery of the British government had already given up on. He was relentless, he was aggressive, and he got results that genuinely shocked people who thought they understood the limits of what British industry could produce. Aircraft production under Beaverbrook increased so dramatically and so quickly that even the most optimistic projections from the Air Ministry looked conservative by comparison. The man was, by any measure, extraordinarily effective. And this is exactly where the story starts to get interesting, because the closer Beaverbrook got to the actual mechanics of power, the more he saw. Not just the heroic version of Winston Churchill that the newspapers were selling to the public, but the real version. The Churchill who made decisions late at night after several glasses of scotch and expected everyone around him to simply execute those decisions without question. The Churchill who could be charming and inspirational one moment and absolutely vicious and vindictive the next. The Churchill who had very specific ideas about the empire, about India, about the relationship between Britain and America, about Stalin and the Soviet Union, ideas that didn't always align neatly with the official story being told to the British public. Beaverbrook saw all of it because that was his job. You don't run a wartime ministry without sitting in on the conversations that never get recorded in the official minutes. What makes the Beaverbrook situation so compelling is that he wasn't just a passive observer. He had his own very strong opinions, and he wasn't shy about expressing them, which is both what made him so valuable to Churchill and ultimately what made him so dangerous. Beaverbrook was genuinely pro-Soviet in a way that went well beyond what was politically convenient or strategically necessary. He believed that Britain needed to open a second front in Europe much earlier than Churchill was willing to do. He believed that the Soviet Union was bearing an unfair and catastrophic share of the war's burden, while Britain and America maneuvered cautiously on the sidelines, and he said so loudly and repeatedly, both in private conversations and in ways that leaked into his newspapers. For Churchill, who was running an incredibly delicate diplomatic balancing act between Washington and Moscow, this was not just inconvenient, it was a genuine problem. The tension between them started to build in ways that people on the inside could feel, but that rarely made it into official accounts. Churchill valued Beaverbrook's energy and his results, but he was increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that Beaverbrook knew too much and was too willing to use what he knew. There's a fascinating pattern in Churchill's relationships with powerful men who got close enough to see behind the curtain. At a certain point, almost without exception, those men found themselves being carefully, methodically moved away from the center of power. Sometimes it happened suddenly, sometimes it was gradual, but it happened. And with Beaverbrook, it happened in a way that was particularly striking, given how central he had been to the entire war effort. In February 1942, Beaverbrook resigned from the War Cabinet. The official explanation was health reasons, and to be fair, he did have genuine health problems, including severe asthma that had plagued him for years. But anyone who looked at the timing and the circumstances found it very difficult to accept the health explanation at face value. This was the middle of the war. This was one of the most critical periods in the entire conflict, and the man who had essentially built Britain's air defense capability from scratch was walking out the door because of asthma. The British press, much of which Beaverbrook himself owned, reported it with a kind of careful neutrality that itself told a story. Nobody pushed too hard on the question of why, really, and that absence of pushing was itself revealing. What happened after Beaverbrook left the inner circle is where things get genuinely strange. He didn't disappear entirely from public life. He was too powerful and too well connected for that, but he was never again given a position of real authority within the wartime government. Churchill sent him on various diplomatic missions, most notably to Moscow and to Washington, which sounds impressive until you realize that sending someone on diplomatic errands is one of the oldest and most effective ways of keeping them busy without actually giving them any real power. You're important enough to be sent as an envoy. You're not important enough to be in the room where the actual decisions are being made. It's a very elegant solution to the problem of what to do with someone who knows too much and can't simply be fired without causing a scandal. The Moscow mission in particular is worth looking at closely because it reveals something important about the dynamic between Churchill and Beaverbrook that the official histories tend to gloss over. Beaverbrook went to Moscow in 1941 as part of a joint Anglo-American delegation to negotiate aid to the Soviet Union, and by all accounts he was genuinely enthusiastic about it in a way that went beyond mere professional duty. He met with Stalin, he came away deeply impressed, and he returned to London convinced more than ever that Britain needed to do more, commit more, sacrifice more to support the Soviet war effort. Churchill received these views with the particular kind of polite attention that British politicians give to opinions they have no intention of acting on. The gap between what Beaverbrook believed should happen and what Churchill was actually prepared to do was becoming impossible to paper over. There's another layer to this that almost never gets discussed, and it connects directly to the media empire that Beaverbrook controlled. When you own newspapers that reach millions of people every day, you have a kind of power that even a wartime prime minister has to take seriously. Churchill understood this perfectly because he had spent decades cultivating press relationships and understood better than almost anyone how much political careers depended on favorable coverage. Beaverbrook's papers had been instrumental in building the public image of Churchill as the indispensable wartime leader, the lone voice who had warned about Hitler when everyone else was appeasing him, the bulldog who would never surrender. That image was not entirely false, but it was carefully constructed, and Beaverbrook knew exactly how it had been constructed because he had helped construct it. A man who knows how your image was built also knows how it can be dismantled, and that knowledge is a very particular kind of power. After the war ended and Churchill was voted out of office in the 1945 election, a result that shocked Churchill and the Conservative Party far more than it shocked anyone who had actually been paying attention to British public opinion. The relationship between the two men entered a new and even stranger phase. Beaverbrook remained loyal to Churchill in a personal sense, and Churchill continued to correspond with him and visit him at his properties, but the old intimacy was gone. Beaverbrook wrote a memoir about the early years of the war that was praised for its vividness and detail, and reading it carefully, you can see exactly where he stopped telling the full story. There are passages that feel oddly truncated, moments where you expect the narrative to go deeper, and it simply doesn't, as if someone had drawn an invisible line and Beaverbrook had decided, for reasons of his own, not to cross it. Historians who have spent time with Beaverbrook's private papers, the ones held at the Parliamentary archives, have noted that there are gaps in the correspondence from certain critical periods that are difficult to explain by simple archival decay or poor record-keeping. Letters are missing from precisely the moments when the tension between Beaverbrook and Churchill would have been at its highest. Whether those letters were destroyed, whether they were removed, whether they were simply never written, because the two men communicated in ways that left no paper trail, nobody can say for certain. But the pattern is there, and patterns like that don't appear by accident in the records of careful, powerful men who understood very well that history is written by those who control the archives. What are we left with when we put all of this together? We're left with the portrait of a man who was genuinely indispensable to one of the most celebrated achievements in modern British history, who saw more of the real Churchill than almost anyone else alive, who had the means and potentially the motive to tell a very different version of the story, and who, at the critical moment, chose not to, or was prevented from doing so. And that ambiguity is precisely what makes the Beaverbrook story so endlessly fascinating, because we can't know for certain which it was. What we do know is that Churchill survived politically and historically in a way that depended very heavily on certain stories not being told, certain documents not surfacing, certain very well-informed men keeping their counsel. Beaverbrook was the most well-informed of all of them, and the fact that he ended his life having told only part of what he knew is one of the great unresolved mysteries of 20th century British political history. The next time you read one of those straightforward heroic accounts of Churchill saving Britain from the Nazis, It's worth pausing for a moment to think about the men who stood closest to him, who knew what the heroism actually cost and what it required and what was done in its name that never made it into the official record. Beaverbrook was one of those men. He knew too much. And then, in all the ways that actually matter, he disappeared.